Well, thanks all. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to be in a new space and meet new people and learn new things. So as I was putting this together, I wasn't sure what the level of knowledge was in the class, I wasn't sure what the level of interest was in the group, and I wasn't sure the level of prior knowledge in the group. So I'm gonna start with, I have different ways I can go. I just kind of threw a bunch of stuff into a PowerPoint presentation and I can jump around the order. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, or you would like an explanation or example, please stop me and ask. Or if you're like, yeah, I got this, move on, also stop and ask, because I need to know that information. And Heather and I were in touch a little bit, because people, when they say gender, often mean women, that just because it's in it, but men have gender too. So, and that particularly comes out in war. And so where I wanted to start very simply, I realized I probably, because I have to move it on that one. I probably should have put another word in here. War and ideals of gender are mutually constitutive. They impact each other. What we bring with us moves into how war is fought, how war is justified, how war ends. But similarly, wartime is a place where gender ideals come out extremely strongly. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit to give you some examples. But both masculinity and femininity are part of the process and always have been. So what I have here is an image. So I started with an image that has absolutely nothing to do with any of the wars that you all are going to be talking about in your group, nothing at all. But I started with this image because I love it, because it's incredibly rich. So what I'm telling you about it is that it's called The Discovery of America. It was done by Jan van der Straat in 1575. And I want you to just take a minute to look at it carefully. And if that means getting up and walking closer or changing your angle, go ahead and do that. But I want you to take a good look at it.
We actually looked at this image in my Latin conquest and exploration class.
Okay, cool.
That's so cool.
Is that supposed to be Columbus?
Yes.
So tell me what you see. Before we get into what any of it means, just tell me what you see. It's not a trick question.
I mean, so I see, a man probably looks like a female, sitting in
Okay, so we have a woman in the hammock, we've got a man standing next to her.
yeah.
What
Looks
else?
like one being, undressed.
Okay, yes.
means-
She is not wearing clothing.
Yeah.
What else?
I see modern new ideals, new thinking, technology against primitive.
Yeah, give us some examples. What technology are you seeing?
It's like a compass or some kind of a device. in
Yep,
his
so
left hand.
astrolabe,
Yeah,
Big old warship.
big old warship. What else?
the staff representing Christianity.
Yep, we have a cross on top of the staff. So there's Christianity, technology, Christianity.
Looks like a pretty modern hammock.
Okay.
I wonder if they brought it, just gave it to her.
I guess our modern hammock stayed at least back to 1575. No nylon, no, none of the camping ones. What else?
What about the animals?
What about them? What about them?
Well, I see one that, I mean, they seem, the one in the right-hand corner seems slightly nefarious.
Yeah, also, what is it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Looks like
Looks like anteater.
Nobody knows.
Okay.
Anteater, a possum, dog, who knows? Okay, good. What else? I mean, then there's this thing, right?
Yeah,
Is it a
no.
goat?
Is it a horse?
It
sounds like a
monkey?
horse.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to that one in a little bit. But what else do you see here?
Somebody in the back.
Yeah.
Okay, there are people back here.
Mhm.
Fire.
There's fire, there's smoke.
I see vulnerability.
Okay, so let's get to some of the messaging here. What is going on in this picture?
The woman's helpless.
Okay, y'all agree?
She doesn't have any technology, any weapon, nothing. She's just laying there vulnerable to this man who's got everything.
Okay. What else can you tell me about it?
We'll say, it looks like the man, the explorer, whoever it is not leaning forward so much, but maybe sort of, you know, from a position of some authority, but not
Okay.
aggressive
Okay.
necessarily.
Not necessarily, but he's definitely erect, and she is incumbent.
Yeah.
If you look at the way the woman's hands are placed, she's got one back like she's leaning back, and then an arm out like, you know, like almost kind of a defensive position in a sense.
Yeah, and in the interest of time, I'll tell you that my students, and I've been teaching this image for a long time, my students are always divided. Is she just surprised, or is she inviting, or is she self-defense? They don't agree, and I don't have an answer. I can't
Right.
tell you. Right, but there's something going on there. Okay, tell me what else the messaging here is.
The man is the conqueror.
He is the conqueror. We know that. Well, we know that it's discovery of America. He's not Columbus specifically, right? This is allegory. She's America, he's Europe. Okay? But he's there to do what?
Civilization and
Progress.
Yeah, progress, civilization, barbarism. How do we know this?
Bringing something, like he seems to be bringing
He's
something.
clearly bringing, right? The motion of this
Yeah,
picture
yeah, exactly.
is
Yeah.
moving that way.
Yeah.
Right, we've got
Oh,
the
that's
ship.
all right, yeah.
We have the technology, we've got the Christianity. I don't know how well you can see it, but he's got a sword.
Mm.
It is under his coat,
Yeah.
right? But this is conquest. And America is represented as what? So that's Europe.
Mm.
What's America?
naked, fertile.
Backwards.
Naked, fertile, backwards. How do we know it's backward?
Uncivilized. 'Cause
Uncivilized.
At that point, you know, a woman, you're not gonna show your ankles, let alone be completely naked.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's untamed, right? So the animals are sort of
Wilderness.
walking freely with
Wild.
the woman.
Yeah, right. It's this, it's not quite the Garden of Eden, right? But
Right.
it's lush, it's fertile, it's open, it's inviting. It is also very clearly uncivilized. You can see that in the clothing, which all of you thought about. Can anybody, this is hard to see. Can anybody tell what's being cooked in the fire?
Body.
It's a leg.
It's a leg, it's a human leg.
Okay.
That's being roasted over a spit,
Yeah.
right? So it's like cannibalism, right? All of this stuff. So this is very much a picture about conquest, whether it is war and conquest or some other form of conquest. It's also very obviously conquest. It's also heavily, heavily gendered, right? How do masculinity and femininity
Mhm.
play into this imagery? What do you think?
I mean, they are norms, right? You're supposed to assume are stable, right, in some way,
Sure.
right?
Right. I mean, the guy, and he's Dutch. By the way, do you think he's ever been to America?
Probably not.
Why not?
1492 is when Columbus got there, and at that point, then they started sending. It was Spanish and Portuguese people that were taking over the Americas at that time. Dutch hadn't sent people over yet.
They were getting on it, right?
Yeah.
Like New York eventually is
Yeah.
first settled by the Dutch, but
Yeah.
The Dutch were busy going around Africa, heading towards Asia, weren't they?
yeah, I actually probably should have looked up exactly when the first Dutch settlements in
Yeah,
America
it's
were.
not that far away.
It's not that far
No,
away.
But
No,
you,
it's-
he's talking
it's
about like
close.
how what he's depicting.
What
Yeah.
Yeah.
Additionally, these animals, nobody knows what they are.
No, right.
They've never seen American fauna.
Right.
Right? So, you know, this is based on word of mouth coming home and
Yeah.
ideas, right? So there's that.
It's imagination.
But it's masculinity conquering femininity, right? The things that she has are feminine, fecundity, fertility, you know, all of that, as well as not quite civilized. And the stuff that he has, technology, force, Christianity, that's masculine, right? Even just in their body language, he's erect, she is incumbent, right? Whatever is going on there, this is full of gendered imagery. And we, even still, despite the fact that this was done 400 years ago almost, like 350 years ago, we still see elements of that built into the ways that we in our modern moment construct masculinity and femininity. It's not all the same. It's why you don't look at it and be like, boom, gender, right? Like, but there's pieces there. And so the idea of war and conquest as being structured through gender is not any way, shape, or form new. So that's one thing.
Mhm.
Two, modern Americans are usually pretty familiar with martial masculinity. And for our purposes, I'm defining martial masculinity as the idea that war is inherently masculine. And in fact, it builds men by fostering strength, toughness, independence, heroism, virility, etc. And that has obviously been complicated by the fact that women in the modern military are a significant portion of the force, right? So it's important to note that it changes over time, but I would argue pretty strongly it's not gone away. So that's, and just some ideas about what that looks like. Right, here are some images from the War of 1898 or the Spanish-American War. You can see the muscular men with their weaponry. Comes up World War I, the United States Army builds men, and it says in the background there, crafts, character, physique. This is incredibly phallic. The weaponry as phallic imagery, it shows up all the time. But sometimes you're like, oh my God, really? That's, yeah, anyway.
Check out his big bomb.
World War II, you see it again, it shows up similar kind of imagery to World War I. These are from men's magazines from the Cold War era, the Vietnam War. There's a fantastic book that a historian by the name of Greg Dattis put out called Pulp Vietnam. These magazines with titles like, Man's Magazine or Man's World or, there's tons of them. They were everywhere. They were extraordinarily popular. So here is a question for you. For the boys who grew up in the 50s and 60s imbibing this kind of imagery, and then you go over to Vietnam, right? Think about how the imagery about how to be a sex genius and, hell sub-nymph and the sinful sisters and whatever else are gonna impact the way that American men see not only the American women who are serving over in Vietnam, but Vietnamese women as well, right? And so I jotted down as Heather was speaking, if martial masculinity by the era of the Vietnam War is this, right? How not to be soft, how not to be weak, how do you prove you're not soft or weak or feminine, right? It's through acts of courage and heroism and sexual conquest. So how does that impact the women that they come up? How do you prove it, right? You have to prove it somehow, because if not, then you can be accused of not being manly enough. So it's all over with that. Okay, point 3, martial masculinity is often used to show up domestic masculinity. This is a pretty famous, this propaganda poster is from London from World War I. But what's the messaging here?
Yeah.
What is the messaging here? Right, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? What is this trying to accomplish?
That he was in the war? I mean,
If you
every
was-
man was probably in the war, would be what my guess is. If I was gonna read that,
So this is 1915?
Almost trying to guilt him or shame
Yeah.
him into.
yeah.
Yeah. If you don't join up now, young men of England,
Yep.
what are your children going to think of you when they ask that question?
There's a
right?
really interesting scene in Spielberg's Lincoln, where his son, Lincoln's son, is constantly hounding him. He wants to be part.
Yep.
And he has this great line. It's like, after the war, nothing else is going to matter. Degrees
Exactly.
won't matter. It's what you did during the war. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's fair. I mean, William James wrote about it.
Yeah,
Franklin
no,
wrote
it's all
about
over the
it,
place.
Yeah.
I ran a Google search. This is a screenshot of my computer. I just ran the Google search. This is for Oneida silver, like silverware, like you would get when you get married if you are registering for stuff.
Yeah.
But they ran, one image in and of itself does not a pattern make. But, look at the just consistency of what comes across through this particular ad campaign, right? Home for keeps. This is a post-war or looking toward the post-war, right? When everybody's going to quote return to normal, get married. go have their 2.5 children behind the white picket fence and buy silverware, right? But who are these men and who are these women and what is the message?
They're war heroes.
Yeah,
Yes,
in a
you are.
particular physical vein,
Yeah.
right? Like,
They all look handsome.
yes.
And they're all kissing.
Heterosexual.
It's
They're all
totally
taller.
heterosexual. It's
Pretty much all white.
they're all
White, yeah.
white. It's a very specific imagery, and you can also talk about the imagery of femininity in these as well, right? So, and it's not just Oneida that went this way. There, you can find this stuff. It's all over the place. You know, Coke ads and all over the place. But I got an email about this book like a week ago. So I screenshotted the website of this as well, right? From Major General Bill Mullen, retired, What It Means to Be a Man, How to Become a Better Person Through Your Military Service, right? So even though it has changed, it is changing, it's not static, it's still very much there and with us. And I have a feeling there's some folks in here who could tell some stories. But what I want to point out, though, is that I was asked to talk about masculinity and citizenship. So point 4 is that in the modern US, martial masculinity is deeply, deeply connected to ideals of citizenship. And that can take a lot of different forms. So think about how we define deserving, or what citizenship means. I was chatting with somebody earlier today about military service fast-tracking actual citizenship, right? The idea of belonging officially and through the legal paperwork in the United States, right? And so there's rationale for that if you fight for your country, it is your country. So even if you were born somewhere else, the notion that military service should lead to citizenship seems to make some sort of sense. It should be some kind of fast track. But think about other questions. Why do soldiers receive benefits that other Americans do not? And we can discuss the bureaucratic problems with those benefits, right? Like there was a big discussion yesterday about the problems with the VA and who gets that, you know, and TRICARE and confusing and getting the right amount of, you know, disability. So there are obviously problems, but that's not what I'm dealing with right here. It's more like, yeah, but American citizens writ large do not get health care, right? Unless they meet certain other things. So why is it? I mean, think about it for a second. Why do soldiers receive benefits that other Americans do not?
Oh, did you want us to answer that?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Not
Because we're willing to do things that other Americans will not. We're willing to sign a blank check for our life so other Americans can do whatever the hell they want.
Okay. And that, there is something to be said for that answer in the era of the all-volunteer force.
Well, they could have volunteered.
But what about during the draft era?
Or those that can.
Exactly. Right? There are people who have been excluded from military service on purpose. So even if they want to sign that check, right, that blank check, they can't, or they haven't been allowed to. And who are those people historically?
Women and minorities.
Yeah, women and minorities.
Women,
African Americans.
African Americans specifically, people who are disabled, physically or otherwise, people who are queer and out, people who are trans. They're at different times, people with different citizenship statuses. So in other words, historically speaking, there are people who are actually by policy excluded. So they couldn't make the choice, right? Things change when you're out of into the all-volunteer era and when pathways have been open to people. But that hasn't always been the case, and the fact is that the GI Bill, which is the thing that, I mean, so you can get into Civil War pensions and you can get into what happened after World War I, but the thing that we really think about is the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, even in the way it was distributed, the way it was discussed, the way it was passed, it grew out of a progressive era push to actually get all Americans a floor under them. But the only thing that could get through was if it was tied to military service during World War II, which then by definition is almost entirely men. And even then, almost women didn't take their GI Bill benefits because they weren't offered in the same way. usually,
Yeah, you talked about
which
that
is what we
yesterday.
talked about, right, with your 106-year-old wave.
Mhm.
You know, women were pressured not to take the benefits, even if they could have. And then they got that through their husbands. People who were African American, right, yeah, technically they could get low interest loans, but you had to find a bank that would give you a low interest loan, and that was hard.
Neighborhood that would sell to you.
And postmasters who would bring you your mail. Literally, there are all these structural ways in which that was held back. And so what does that say about belonging?
Even the American Legion, there's an American Legion post here in Indianapolis, it's predominantly African American now, because when it was chartered, African Americans were not allowed to go to other establishments with whites, so they created their own American Legion post to have a post to go to.
Yeah, and women
it's
did the
still
same.
predominantly African American.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly. So there are all these things. You know, why do benefits accrue to whole military families, not just the soldier? And we can talk about where the limits of that are. I think there was some discussion around that yesterday. But it's based on the idea that the soldier is going to be a man, and the man has to support his family because that's the man's job. Right? That goes all the way back in the era of the Revolution. Continental soldiers got, you know, deeds for land in the West so that they could be landowners because that defined citizenship and masculinity. Right? It goes all the way through, and I'll talk about that in a second. So we can talk about that. How have minoritized people used veteran status to argue for equal rights? Right? Why have African Americans or women or people who are queer, why have they fought so hard for the ability to have equal service? Right? It's because the idea is, well, if you serve your country, then you deserve something. It's about responsibilities and rights. So if you can prove that you're capable of the responsibility, then you deserve the rights. And that is a constant over time. If the groups change, but the language does not necessarily. And then finally, how has veteran status been used to legitimate political stances?
Oh, yeah,
Right? Think about
that's fascinating.
who gets to say, my voice matters in this space.
How has that developed over time? Like, are there periods where it hasn't had as much sense as others? Do you get a sense?
Yeah, now. Literally now.
Yeah.
As we are a full generation plus post-draft all-volunteer force with no war that's required the draft.
So you think it doesn't have as much?
It's beginning,
Is it-
so it has different pull. So this
Okay.
has actually been one of the arguments that's been made for a long time, for example, for why women should be allowed to serve, is because politicians run on their veteran status.
We have one here. in
Yeah, as do
Indiana.
our governor's a veteran, our senators a veteran, you know, both women, you know, it's their thing. So that's still important, right? Because it lends a certain legitimacy to various things, right? If you're gonna talk about national defense, then to be a veteran somehow gives you knowledge of that, which may or may not be true, right? It certainly gives you a set of experiences, but are you telling me that someone who served as Secretary of State doesn't know about foreign policy if they're not a veteran? Right, politics aside, you know, you can think about that.
Yeah.
But it's really only since the World War, and it's funny, I mean, is that one of the reasons why we're hanging on to the World War II generation so tightly? I don't know. But I think now is where it's beginning to change, but it's obviously not gone away. Look at what the news makes out of younger Congress people who are veterans on both sides of the aisle,
Yep. Yep.
right?
Yep.
It's a coming back.
Yep.
It's like a thing we lost somewhere along the way that now is coming back.
So I think it's almost like a nostalgia for the generation that we have lost in a sense.
Potentially, but it's
That's
also
interesting,
that
yeah.
we haven't given up the idea that military service equals ability to be a good politician.
Yeah.
Well, didn't we just learn recently in your class, Eisenhower's warning for whoever comes in as president if they have no.
Oh, he had no illusions about what military people do.
Oh, yeah.
You know? But yeah, he was really disturbed by what he had created.
Like he said something, I feel sorry for those who have not seen what I've seen or something like that.
And that are following him basically, you know, inheriting the military industrial complex. Anyway, yeah.
It's-
I'm not.
I was just trying to.
No, that is a thing, right? That people who also who have served understand what it means, and it doesn't match the ideals that people
Yeah.
sometimes have. And then there's also this: U.S. citizenship has never been predicated on military service ever.
Uh-huh.
Right. You don't have to serve the military to be a citizen, and that's always been true, right? There was the Militia Act of 1792, which required all free white men to drill in a local militia that would be run through the state or locality, but that could be federalized in the event of war, right? So that's as close as it came, but there were loopholes upon loopholes. One, it left out everybody, in many cases who weren't even landowners, even if they were white men, because local spaces would do other things. Left out black people, left out women, left out, whole groups of people. So, who were still ostensibly citizens, although what citizenship means in 1792 is something different than what it means in 1944 or today or whatever. But the point is that we have never had a society that says you have to serve to be a citizen. It's not like Rome, right, ancient Rome. Point 6, martial masculinity is really complex. It varies by group and it changes over time. And I just threw up the covers of some books because I cannot get into all of it. You all gave me an hour. And you don't really want to know. But it's true for, going back into the antebellum era. The books I pulled pretty much deal with like the eras of the Spanish-American War and the Vietnam War and left a lot out. But the way that masculinity functions, it does change over time. Even though I showed you a bunch of images that have some significant commonalities between them, doesn't mean it's always the same. And also, it varies by group. So again, the way, for example, black male soldiers sort of expressed masculinity and their right to citizenship is going to look a little different from how white male soldiers in the same moment are doing it. Right, so that's important to note. And also I should note here too that they're always, it's also always in contest with femininity. So as ideals of womanhood change over time, ideals of manhood are going to change over time. Neither of them is going to be static. And there's a famous article that talks about masculinity and femininity being two strands of DNA, and that if you move from any one position on one, you have to move the other, right? They don't exist without each other. So if you have questions, I'll answer them, but I'm just going to glide over that for the moment. Martial masculinity is not the only masculinity available, even in wartime, and that is what I want to spend the rest of my time on, because that's what I've done looked at in my research. So you can talk about different kinds of masculinities in the services, and the ways, for example, people who remained stateside during World War I or World War II, or even now, I guess, construct their sense of belonging within the military around ideals of protection and gender, and those who are in the front lines. Right, there are always going to be those tensions within the military. But there's also other stuff that's not military, that's existing at the same exact time. And so, for example, I love this picture. The assumption that all men were they just rushed to join up after Pearl Harbor is only semi-true. And by February 1942, it's basically not true. Okay? So yes, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, there was a rush to join up, right? Recruiting stations pretty famously had to stay open in New York City 24 hours a day to accommodate the men who were looking to rush and, fight. That wave crests pretty quickly. And from that point on, the US government is fighting tooth and nail to get enough men into services to do what needs doing. You do not get 16 million people into uniform without both a carrot and a stick, right? You don't. I mean, we can't get 16 million Americans to do anything. I mean, literally. We can't get people to wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic. So we're definitely not going to get them to sign up to go into war. It's just not going to happen. And so different kinds of men begin to construct their understandings of what it means to be a man or be a person based on other things, like self-preservation. This picture here, I don't know who's who because it wasn't labeled. But Harold Gower and his buddies were this group of guys. They sent letters back and forth to each other throughout the war, talking about how they're going to try to get out of service, right? Like, one of these guys happens to be the guy who wrote Psycho, the book. And there are all of these letters about, oh, we got to get him married so he won't have to go into service. And you can see, because they did these tableaus, I don't know, they were kind of interesting, weird guys, but like, they did these tableaus, and they're like, well, this is what's going to happen to us if we end up in the service. We're all going to be dead or wounded or disfigured or whatever, and clearly less than, and that hurts, and I don't want to do it, right? And that actually was much more common during World War II than the patriotic rush to join up. And it came out in a lot of different ways, but one of the things that I do in my book is I talk about, well, what's going on there. The issue, the reason we don't know about this is because, one, to get 16 million men into uniform, over time you've got to tighten up the restrictions, right? You have to make it harder and harder and harder to get those deferments, to get out of service. So by 1944-45, it was almost impossible to stay out of service if you were a male and able-bodied. That's why 80% of that cohort served. It's not because they wanted to, it's because eventually they had no choice and they got sucked into it and couldn't figure out a way out.
Is it also that the infrastructure for any kind of training ramped, I mean, it seemed to be so small or weak before the war began, but was that part of it, or?
It is, but not
Okay.
in the way you might think.
Yeah.
Because the infrastructure starts ramping up in 1940. The draft begins in 1940, May, I think 1940, so a year and a half before Pearl Harbor.
So they're ready for war.
So there are significant limits on it, because the only way to get it passed during peacetime was to say, all right, it's got to be slightly older men, they can't serve out of the U.S. proper, there are significant limits, but they're already ramping up training facilities. And that continues, I mean, it obviously takes years to get into place the infrastructure that eventually exists during World War II. But it does.
It does.
And I just have a couple other photos, right? These are,
Mhm.
this one's very
That's
famous
great.
from Vietnam. Girls say yes to boys who say no, right? About the construction of masculinity as objectors. And it's not even just limited to Vietnam. There's an article out there that talks about, so people who refuse to register, cooperate, people who are conscientious objectors. You can be a conscientious objector in a couple of different ways. One is that you will go into non-combatant service. In World War II, you also had the option of, if you were found sincere, you could go to a civilian training camp, CPS camp, civilian public service. And there are instances, these guys, they were doing forestry, they were doing fire control, actually. One of those things that we send prisoners to do now. But there were people who were volunteering, they were conscientiously objected to war and to shooting other people, but they constructed a form of masculinity that involved like being strong and tough and ready by parachuting into forest fires, right? And so you can see certain connections and certain differences and whatnot. And then of course, the GI movement has a lot to do with it, and a lot of it too comes out through the civil rights movement and the ways that the civil rights movement changes as a result of the Vietnam War and who's getting sent over to Vietnam. So it's not about not fighting here, but where are we fighting? Who needs to be fought? It's not the North Vietnamese, right? It's the American government. So there are different ways of thinking about it. And then here's the thing. Even the federal government does not always privilege martial masculinity in wartime. And so what my research, I look at the draft and who was required to be drafted, who was able to get out of the draft. I started with the question of why was the Vietnam War so inequitable? Why were people of color and working class white men so much more likely to be sent into Vietnam than anybody else? And the answer is because the policies were set up that way, explicitly. And that's the piece that nobody really thinks about all that much. But if you think about the deferment system, first of all, for those who didn't know, the draft was in place almost without break from 1940 to 1973. So whether war or peace, there was a draft going on, it was in place, induction authority was held by the US government. There was one little window in 47, 48 where they suspended it, but other than that, that whole chunk of time. And it makes sense to have a selective system. That's what selective service means. It means you don't take everybody because you don't want everybody, right? What would the military do? Once World War II is over, what is the military gonna do with all those men as the baby boomers start coming of age? Doesn't want them all. Can't do anything with them, right? Literally, what would it cost to do that? So they don't want everybody. The men themselves don't necessarily want to serve. And also, you do need to actually keep some people back on the home front to do some of the things that need doing. And as history shows, and as we've already talked about, you can push women into new kinds of jobs, civilian-wise. You can bring women into the military to do desk jobs and other non-combatant roles, if that's what you're thinking women do. But what are the things that men do? Why are men important, right, on the home front? Well, they can work in jobs that are deferred for industry or to help with the economy, right? They can be deferred for agricultural reasons to help grow the food that the United States needs. But what about some of these others? Deferred a student for higher education. Why do we need college students or graduate students? Why are they better at home? The 2S deferment was added literally in the middle of the Korean War, when the selective service is scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel, because they can't draft people who already served during World War II unless they're still in the reserves. That did happen at the beginning of the war a lot. They can't draft, they're already deciding that we can't draft people who are in certain occupations and whatnot. And that because of the Depression, the number of 18, 19-year-old men was really low. Right? Lower birth rate 20 years earlier means fewer men now. So they're like scraping the bottom of the barrel, trying to figure out how do we get more men. Oh, great time to add a student deferment and defer all the college kids. Why? Actually, non-rhetorically, does anyone have any ideas why you might stick that in there? And it's okay if you don't. I'm just, let's see where you're thinking at.
Fortunate sons.
Yeah.
Parents who were a little bit more well off, who were able to send their kids to college, their kids were able to go to college and stuff, was typically at that time probably a more higher class of people being able to go to college.
You're absolutely right in that college was only in the process of becoming democratized, because remember, thanks to the GI Bill, this is a moment where college enrollments are exploding with people who had never gone to college before, right? But they are primarily veterans. They've already done their service.
So they're not gonna be drafted no matter what.
They're not gonna get drafted, no.
So you're asking why the government
Yeah, what would
created
be the
this?
importance of putting that in place in 1951?
Thinking ahead, Cold War technology.
Ooh, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. So if you think about what's going on geopolitically in that moment, right? The war in Korea is important, right? And they are desperately trying to get men and women. There was a huge campaign to get women to enlist during the Korean War. It pretty much failed, right, as Heather mentioned. But they're trying really hard to get these guys in, but they're like, this is kind of the new normal, right? If we're in a Cold War, that even when this hot one over here ends, we're still gonna be in. And we gotta beat the Soviets. And we need people in technology, we need people in engineering, we need people in medicine, we need people doing the research. And it doesn't matter what research they're doing, right? There's a quote as they're figuring this out, in the 1910s, everybody thought theoretical physics was like ridiculous, like talk about a fringe topic, right? But boom, atomic bomb, it's not so fringe anymore. So nobody knows what the next thing's gonna be, so let's just keep them all there, right? And there were limits and it moved around, and sometimes you had to take a test to qualify and sometimes you didn't, and sometimes it was about like if you were in the top 10% of your class or not, or the top half, I'm sorry. So there was paperwork, because there's always paperwork. But the idea behind the student deferment was we need to keep men, specifically men, in these fields because they're the ones who are going to develop the next bomb, the next antibiotic, the next thing that we need.
So Amy, you've seen like the discussions within the government.
Oh yeah.
who prompted them? What, did it come from a particular agency, or did it come from an advisory board full of scientists or
Yes.
something? Okay, all right, yeah.
So there was an advisory board as they're trying to figure stuff out with selective service. It's pulling like the presidents of universities
Okay,
and they're
okay,
having,
okay.
they're having
Interesting,
those
yeah.
choices, those discussions.
Yeah,
But it also included fathers. Because the thing is, you know, you can talk about reasons of dependency,
yeah.
right? And a dependent, it's your spouse, it's your kid, specifically your wife and your kids, because even women who served didn't automatically get dependents allowance or any benefits for their dependents for their husbands until a court case in 1976, Frontero case represented by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Because the idea was that even if women's service members were married, their husbands were the breadwinners. Their husbands were the one who brought home the money. So unless you could indicate that he was like disabled somehow and unable to work, female service members did not get benefits. So this is very specific. But in the Cold War environment, it has other meanings. Right? The idea of the US being a differently organized space in the Soviet Union is the proof that American capitalist democracy is better than a Soviet communist setup. If Soviet women had to work and drudge away in the fields or in the factories, if they had to put their kids in daycare, if they were living in tiny, you know, apartment blocks, American women, they can stay home. They can live these lives and have their kids at home with them and raise them really well. And they can have all of the modern appliances and luxuries that allow them to live their fullest lives. And how do they get these? They get them because their husbands are out working and earning the money in this heavily middle-class consumerist society. And that literally becomes a flashpoint of the Cold War. Part of it is about how the US, you know, projects itself to help get non-aligned nations to think, oh, American capitalism, not so bad, right? But part of it is literally about discussions about which kind of society is better, right? This is the famous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and then Vice President Nixon. So, you know, a lot going on with regard to fatherhood and ability to support, you know, who's buying the stuff. The economy falls apart if dad doesn't work. So at various times through the 50s, depending on the needs of the military in any given moment, combined with the needs and the population and what's going on, dependency deferments become super wide. You get a dependency deferment if you are married with no children. Right? That says more than about ability to earn money. Right? It does. On the other hand, right, by 1960, we're in a period of time in the US where it is embarrassing that so many Americans are living in poverty. Because how do you prove that a capitalist democracy is the best if a third of your population is living below the poverty line, and some of them in really abject conditions? So there is a whole different set of policies that begins to target poor white men and all men of color for what is called rehabilitation within the military. The idea is that you can bring in men, so first of all, how do you identify who is in trouble in the nation? The reality is that you have, because of the draft, it is a common experience across the male population of the United States to take the entrance exam, right? To take the induction exam, it's a pre-induction exam, I should say. When you register for selective service, you get a pre-induction exam. You get a physical exam, you take the it wasn't the ASVAB yet, AFQT, I think. I'm blanking on my acronym, but it was the precursor to the ASVAB. And you take it, and who tends to fail, right? The people who fail are not eligible for military service. Those are overwhelmingly people who are poor, and they are very disproportionately people of color, which is unsurprising given that the majority of people of color live in the South with segregated schools, right? There are significant social reasons why that would be. But by 1960, 61, that is an incredible embarrassment. So identify these men, get them through the military process, through the pre-induction process, get them help, initially through voluntary rehabilitation programs. This is a Kennedy, the rehabilitation programs are something that Kennedy suggested. He put together a task force to put together a report. He got killed. The task force came out like early in Johnson's administration, and by January '64, so like within 2 months of taking office, there's a plan in place to put social workers and medical health workers and all these other people in the place, in induction in spaces, and for people who fail in the AFES, and then for people who fail, to give them the option to go into voluntary programs. Because the idea is that if you can get job training skills, literacy skills, healthcare, etc., to the young men who are in trouble, then they will go, you know, the idea is that this guy would lift his whole family out of poverty, because then he'd get a better job, and then he'd get married, and his kids would do better, and his siblings would do better, and you can uplift that way. The problem is that by 1964-65, young men who are eligible for these programs are like, hell no, I'm not gonna do this. Because as soon as I fix my literacy, or as soon as I solve my medical problem, where am I gonna go? Vietnam. Because draft calls are rising by 65. So in 1966, the United States military, under Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, creates a program called Project 100,000. I don't know, has anybody heard of it? Okay, so Project 100,000 was McNamara's idea to bring 100,000 men into the military per year, all branches of service, who otherwise would be unqualified for service. They would come in both through voluntary enlistment and the draft. 50,000 men a year drafted who were otherwise not qualified for military service. They would get training in the military, which they could then take back out to their families and do the uplift. And McNamara had been trying this since '64. So it is not, as some people say, like a cynical move to try to create cannon fodder for Vietnam. It is a move to try to act, like he's working from the liberal philosophy at home about how we uplift the United States. It just so happens that by the time he gets it in place in '66, we are full on engaged in Vietnam, and guess who goes to Vietnam in the highest numbers? Draftees. It's the people who are drafted who end up in Vietnam much more heavily than the people who enlist.
So these are the ones who would not have been eligible to serve, are drafted into this program, and end up going to Vietnam anyway.
Yes. And you can slice and dice the numbers in different ways, right? 96% of these so-called New Standards men, who by the way were 40% African American. The military was not keeping track of race or ethnicity beyond black at this point in time. So we don't know about, Hispanic folks or about Native Americans. But if you use socioeconomic understandings about where people tended to be, this would have been a program that was more than 40% minoritized men. But either way, we're talking about way out of proportion with their general population, right? And they're more likely to end up in Vietnam. So 96% of them passed basic training, and usually the number was 98 for the general population. So they're doing pretty well getting out of basic. On the other hand, they're much more likely to be dishonorably discharged, which is somebody's going to follow them for life. Right? There are all different kinds of ways that you can think about it. But it is specifically because of these two sets of policies. On one, the policy was called manpower channeling. Oh, I guess I kind of skipped over it. Right? So you have the deferments in place, but those deferments become called manpower channeling. The Selective Service very explicitly talks about channeling men into positions, letting them keep their deferment till they're 35. Because if you take an agricultural or an occupational deferment or dependency deferment, your liability lasts till age 35 instead of age 26. And by the time they're 35, they're likely to be married, they're likely to have some kids. Where are they going to go? They're going to stay in that position, right? So they're channeling these certain men out of the military through student deferments, through occupational deferments. Because think about what occupations are going to be deferred. Earlier in US history, it had been like tool and die makers and people in industry and like working class positions. But by 50s and 60s, they're changing it. It's teachers, it's engineers, it's mathematicians, it's people who need a college degree and who's getting a college degree, right? So, you're channeling out one set of people and you're channeling in another set of people. And so 354,000 men were eventually brought into the military through Project 100,000. That's 354,000 other men who are not being called into military service. So it's not that people right, because you talk about reality versus ideal, right? The reality didn't change that much between World War II and Vietnam. Men, middle class, particularly white men during the Vietnam era, were able to get out of service because the policies existed. Where by the end of World War II, the same men couldn't get out of military service, but they were both sets of men were trying really hard. They were getting, you can look at like birth rates and when like there are little mini baby booms, and it's always like 9 months to a year after you end deferments for children. Like there's, and it's constant, it's consistent, that exists. So the point that I want to make that I think will be useful, right? Like as you talk to the folks, you know, my research in particular for this project ended in '73 with the end of the draft, right? But so obviously things change. Once you no longer have the pressure of the draft, of course things are going to change, number one, because everybody volunteers. Whether it is a push or a pull factor, they volunteer. In the end, every individual has to make the decision to sign on the line, right? So that's changed. 2, ideas of femininity have changed pretty significantly since 1973, right? What women do, who women are. And the pull of that is still very strong. The other reason why there are people who are against having women register for selective service, some of it's about sending them to combat, but the other half is about, but women are mothers. Who's gonna have the kids? Who's gonna take care of the kids, right? It's the moms are supposed to be home, and so you're gonna ruin femininity if you have women register. But it's not what it was, right? Those arguments do not have the same heft in 2023 as they did in 1980 and 81 when the Supreme Court ruled on it, right? So it's different. So all of the realities and lived experiences of the people who have served in the last 30, 40 years are going to look different from what they were before. But the idea of who's being privileged in what way and how those ideals of masculinity and femininity are functioning, that is still there. You know, and that's for you all to discuss, because I don't have that context necessarily. But yeah, I don't know. I'll open it to questions.